8. A New Dawn. The process of purification served, in the eyes of Gazurgu's priesthood, two purposes. The first, and more material, was punishment, the hard hand of discipline, applied cruelly enough to deter such offenses against the tenets of the Lord of the Sun. The second, and much more valuable, so far as the priests were concerned, was the numbing of the soul to hardship, and the rebirth which followed. Given purgation was only ever offered to those seen worthy of its touch, those who were, in other words, salvageable, it served as a method by which to make any other test or threat pale by comparison. If a subject of Gazurgu's kingdom could endure without begging for the final release of death, then they had proved whatever weakness had once dwelt within them banished, and in so doing stood testament to Gazurgu's grace and patience. The theater for this struggle, in Durank's case, was within the bowels of the second wall, amongst the cells reserved for the punishment of wayward soldiers or the interrogation of captured enemies. It was less impressive than the first and last walls, kitted with more antiquated gun emplacements, and not quite so deeply dug or reinforced. Perhaps, had years allowed, it would have seen further work, but as it stood, its garrisons were not under any illusion they would halt the numberless tides spilling forth against them here. Their goal was to use the second wall as a staging ground for strikes at the Sholoshaitians as they advanced across the eastern hinterland, inflict what casualties they could, and then make an ordered retreat for Surgirkar while a rearguard held up the enemy. Durank had heard talk during the trip of Lautani aid soon to arrive, and the hope seemed to be that the big guns they would bring would even the range disparity, and allow the Ugg to strike back from the fortress city at the Sholoshaitian artillery batteries. Durank had already seen some of the Lautani at work. Not soldiers, but airmen. The islands had their own stable of planes, and when the convoy which had carried he and many thousands of others west to the second wall had been half-heartedly strafed by Sholoshaitian scout planes, a wing of Lautani craft had run them off. It seemed to Durank, and the holy men among whom he was captive were the most vocal in speaking this aloud, that the fate of Gunug hung upon their union with Laut and her children. This made a deep, cosmic sense. Yet he could not help but feel some of the dejected helplessness alive in the rest of the company's talk rub off on him, much as he tried to dismiss or bury it. When at last he had come to the prisons of the second wall, he had been almost glad to escape the talk of the convoy, grim as the cages might be. The prison was empty save Durank, and he was glad of that for more reasons than just the maintenance of his flickering hope. Here, there was no one to witness his shame. The priest from the town of Gaush, where he had been taken into custody, had traveled with Durank as his purgator rather than flee further west to Surgirkar. Koshaba was his name, and he had remained closely interested in Durank's well-being on the brief ride with the convoy to the safety of the wall. Koshaba spoke and ministered long to his charge on the night rumbling west, and had done some small good in rekindling what remained of Durank's belief in a future. Late the following morning, in the dark of the dungeon beneath the wall, after an anguishing struggle to catch more than an hour or two of sleep on the floor, Koshaba joined him. He was accompanied by several attendants who he did not introduce, likely acolytes from temples and settlements behind the wall, or else chaplains of the garrison garbed in robe rather than uniform. Durank, who had not been bound in his barren cell, was invited out to sit on the stone and drink deep of a light and sweet mead Koshaba offered him. It had been years since he had tasted anything save water and bad beer in the service. He was given bread to eat alongside it, plain but fresh. A simple breakfast, but after so long without proper food or drink, he was enraptured with the sensations of it. Your rebirth will be conducted over 7 days, Koshaba told him as he ate. You need only ask at any time during the process, and I will end the rites of purgation, and you will be sent on to your next life. But if you are strong enough to endure, I will release you back into your ranks, and you will be granted the chance to attempt the trials of our dark days anew. If the enemy's hordes threaten to interrupt us in the meantime, I will withdraw you further west, and continue your purification on the road to the capital. The priest took him by the shoulder then, ensuring Durank caught the full weight of his bleached eyes. It was still uncomfortable to look into that endless gaze, but the priest's words were, as ever, soothing despite their strange, airy delivery. I know you are capable. I have seen as much, Koshaba told him. But it will not be easy. I will be with you all the while, and I will give you what comfort the rites allow me to offer. Durank nodded. Koshaba's attendants were heating metal instruments in a heavy basin of coals they had brought in. He watched them as they labored. He exhaled and drew in as much air as his lungs could hold, as if preparing for a dive into icy waters. Durank felt in the moment that he had to endure, that there was no other option. He could not allow his place of death, his last home, to be anything other than Sir Girkar, or else the fields of battle that separated that city from Sholoshaishan arms. And if that was to be done, the only route was through the rites of purgation. But he also knew that this surety would likely evaporate the moment the implements of the priesthood had dug into him, and his nerves were alight with agony. So he waited, and watched, and prayed, trying all the while to steel himself for what must come next. Durank was then stripped of what few adornments of gold rings or clasps adorned his mane. Given his relatively modest background, these had already been meager. He was stripped naked, and told by the aged priest he would wake and eat and sleep stark as a beast until his station as an Ug was reclaimed through the rites. The minor shrapnel wounds he had carried since the morning of his shame were tenderly cleaned and mended. The pelt of his back was shaved clean off, a gentle process, at odds with the torments which awaited him. A passage from a tablet the attendants had carried in was read, begging the notice of Gazorgu, and, should Durank be worthy, his forgiveness. Before long, he was guided up onto a thick, harsh wooden table, and laid out stomach down upon its surface. His hands and feet were bound in shackles to each corner's leg. Each day's practice will stretch only an hour or two, Koshaba told him, but it will feel much, much longer. And, no surprise to Durank, it did. The rites of each of the 7 days of purgation were mostly composed of intricately searing the text of Gazorgu's tenets and mantras into Durank's flesh. First, a scalpel would be used to open a deep wound, and then a narrow heated rod would be used to cauterize the gash from within. The red-hot metal would linger in his skin long, to ensure the scars would raise, and someday be visible even beneath regrown fur. The charred flesh was cautiously cleaned. Then, at the session's end, a segment of Durank's tail would be severed with shears, the ragged cut burned dry to await the next day's rites. He would be left with a stump at week's end, as well as his other scars. The first day was the back, the second his chest, the third and fourth were Durank's upper arms, and the fifth and sixth the meat of his thighs. The entire surface of each was used. Between each session, he would be thrown back in his cell to shiver away the night. As the days drew on and the scars spread, the hot hum of his pain grew more and more intense, and sleep, already scarce, became almost impossible. Mead and a small portion of bread were brought to him each morning just before dawn, as before. Otherwise, he received only water. Koshaba, who said, truly, Durank found, that the hunger of fasting would meld with the pain of his burnt flesh and immerse him in a state of selfless and thoughtless presence in the moment, was alongside him all the while. As Durank curled upon the stone, he seldom thought of anything at all. His mind was too consumed with eking out the next second, or the one after. If he thought, it was only in scattered recollections of prayer, or the scattered images of Sir Girkar, of the home he must reach. Though to Durank these days blurred together, and he knew little beyond the bounds of his discomfort, Koshaba slept sitting up on the stone at the entryway. Though the priest spoke only at dawn or dusk for prayer beyond reciting his engravings aloud during the rites each day, Durank would later ascribe his capacity to lay silent and tolerate the screaming of his skin to him. Occasionally, a soldier from somewhere on the line who had arrived drunk to a fire watch on the wall or been caught doomsaying among the ranks was brought in for a day or night, but, at least on that stretch of the bastion, Durank was mostly left in quiet. At some point near the end of his torments, the distant tremble of thunder returned as some point on the wall not far off came under bombardment, but Durank did not take heed of it. Koshaba's constant, calm company gave shape to the feeling of observation which had hung over Durank since the morning at the abandoned home place back east. Even if he never summoned the focus to tell the man so, he was thankful, in his seconds of clarity before or after troubled sleep, for the priest's presence. The seventh and final day came, a thing Durank was too distracted to even register as a milestone in his state of battered detachment. This was the day of the throat, of the voice. His neck was shaven low, taking care not to harm the bulk of his mane, the disturbance of which was the highest dishonor among the Ugg. The attendants pinned his head firm to the boards. The slicing and branding of that sensitive flesh, by far the most agonizing of anything he'd thus far experienced, jolted Durank out of his stupor. For many of the sessions of rites, he had been able to detach from the experience. Not so now. It was as if the hand of the Solar Lord himself was on him, and he was driven to perceive every screaming synapse set alight by the metal. He shrieked and roared for the first time in his captivity. But the light of the Pillar of Dawn and the glistening walls of the ziggurat of the sun were emblazoned by now upon his consciousness, and even amidst such torments, he did not call for mercy. The last segment of tail was cut, the crunch of bone and gristle all too real to his suddenly keen ears. The careful hands of Koshaba then carved at his face, ensuring he would carry the mark of purgation for all to see ever afterward. Durank was clothed in the simple robes of an acolyte, and he was bidden, when at last he was able, to stand. Few, especially today, can claim to have undergone the purgation and not buckled, Koshaba told Durank as he struggled to slide from his perch and steady himself upon his feet. But you are now one of them. Koshaba took Durank by the arm, saying softly, "Come, you must see the sun." And the priest led his charge out into the corridors of the second wall, the old and feeble supporting the young and ragged, and he took Durank down a corridor of barracks and storerooms much like the ones which had hosted his men on the first wall. But Durank found the tunnels did not bother him as they had in his fevered nightmares. They came to a hatch back past the command quarters, and pushed out onto the plains of the western hinterland, which were not yet marred by foreign shell or boot. And off away over hill and tree and silent township, Durank saw that the sun was westering, not quite setting, but already lending pink and orange hues to the far distance with its descent. and against that deepening sky, though its source was 100 and more miles distant in hallowed Surgirkar, he could see the great heavenward heights of the light thrown up by the Pillar of Dawn, a dancing beam of gold vibrant even against the panoply of the not-quite sunset. "Look into the sun," Koshaba said, "and know your scars are not of shame, but of renewal. And just as the sun will always rise, so too have you risen. You are born anew." Durank looked long, standing in silence beside him. He found his legs, weak as they were, could support him free of the old man's shoulder. The distant thunder of Sholoshaishan bombardment continued, somewhere away south on some unseen portion of the wall, and as the minutes passed, and Durank felt the warmth of the sun's departure, and night began to fall out over the scrub and wind-waved grasses, he felt himself again, stripped of shame or fear, or the visions of death and failure. "Where will they send me now?" Durank asked without intending to. There was eagerness, a need to prove and be proven in it. This was not lost on Koshaba. Durank heard the grin in the priest's voice as he answered. "I see you feel it already, like a man fresh away from home, ready for your burdens, for your struggles. I'm sure your betters will give them to you, but it isn't for me to say. I saw your potential, and I've done what I could. You belong to the king and his armies again now. I'm going west to Surgirkar in the morning. I expect you will be there too before long, in one way or another." Durank stood with him until night had fallen, and the older man had conducted his prayers of dusk. Then Koshaba turned, silent, and strode back inside. The Pillar of Dawn afar west had become faint with the departure of the sun, but its gleam was still visible against the moon and stars. Durank was quiet as he watched it, but despite the priest's departure, he knew he was not alone.